So the idea at hand, what we're getting at tonight is, as been said, is Paul and civil government. It's very interesting because Paul deals with civil government quite often in a lot of his writing. And particularly that has already been brought up at the idea there in Romans 13, verse 1 and following, that he tells us and reminds us that the powers that are to be are ordained of God. And therefore, it exists with God's sanction. And the rulers are ideally ministers of God, verses 4 and verse 6. And they're there for our protection, to protect those and reward those who do good. And if you think about it, as a Christian, our relationship to the civil government ought to be a good one, because they're there to help protect those who do good. And what are Christians here to do? To do good. So, but as you know, particularly there in the first century and with Paul and others, you have Nero and others who were in charge, and they were not always seeking good, and yet they were in charge. We'll get into that here in a few moments. But they're to protect us, to reward us, those who seek to do good, and to punish those who do evil. You know, through this lectureship, we're going to have a lot of different topics, and we're talking about the death penalty tomorrow and voting and all these other kind of things, the ways that we as Christians can participate and be at one with our civil government in dealing with those particular things. But inspiration charges us to obey civil authorities. Let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers. And the idea of resistance amounts to withstanding God's will. And thus Paul commands us to pray for kings and all that are in high places. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 1 and 2. But can a Christian, with the Lord's approval, ever resist the laws of government? Now, my dad already kind of introduced some of this, but I'm going to go a little bit further and go into some other ideas of this very idea. The Bible clearly answers that not only can we, but under certain circumstances, we must refuse to obey civil law. And this gets into a phrase that's been called civil disobedience. I want you to think about something. In Acts 1 and verse 8, Jesus ordered his apostles to preach the gospel in Jerusalem. But the court ordered later Peter and John under threat to cease preaching, chapter 4 and verse 18. And when all the apostles were arrested for resuming their preaching, the court reminded them of this earlier ban. And Peter responded with the words, "We must obey God rather than man," chapter 5 and verse 29. So always, civil government is no better than the person who sits in the seat of power and makes laws. And so we think about this as we go and we begin to look at what Paul teaches regarding our obligation to civil government and how the Christian is to act while they are here upon this earth. If you would, turn to Philippians chapter 2, begin at verse 12. Philippians chapter 2, beginning at verse 12. Paul writes, "Wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings." Now, I want you to pay special attention to verse 15, because that's the one we're going to kind of deal with here for the next few moments. "That you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Yea, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy and rejoice with you all. For the same cause also do ye joy and rejoice in me. So Paul reminds the brethren there in Philippians that they are to shine as lights in the world. The Apostle Paul has given us a direction. He's given hope as well as a warning. The direction is we are to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. Our responsibility. With hope. In other words, he reminds them that it is God who works in them. And then a warning to do all things without murmuring and disputing. But what is the ultimate goal of these admonitions that Paul has given? Well, in verse 15, he says that the child of God will be without fault. Is this how we will truly shine as lights in the world? Living as children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation? The child of God without fault, seriously, they will shine as lights and make a positive impact upon the world in which they live. But note carefully, it is not just to be children of God, but we must be without fault. And he says that we are also to be blameless and harmless. Let's look at those two words, blameless and harmless. What does that mean? Well, blameless means the idea of someone who deserves no censure, free from fault or defect. Now, it doesn't mean that we are perfect, because we know the Bible teaches us very plainly that we do sin. But the idea there is that there is nothing that can be laid at our feet, no charge that can be made against us. Paul told Titus to live and act in such a way that those who oppose us have nothing evil to say of us. Titus chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. In other words, we are to live in such a way that we have no outstanding faults that are so clearly evident to other people. Why is this important? Well, nothing hinders our efforts or our influence over others more than inconsistency and hypocrisy. You know, if we have a glaring faults that are evident to other people, they will not take our message very seriously. Especially if we are trying to point out their faults. How do we become blameless? Well, the Bible tells us that we should practice what we preach. That's a principle that comes from the Bible. This would include working out our own salvation. When we sin, we will confess our faults, especially when it is evident to all. And when one endeavors to preach to others, we do it in a spirit of gentleness, patience, and humility. Galatians 6 and verse 1. Then the word harmless. Paul uses this word. It means without a mixture of evil, free from guile, innocent or simple. It is used 3 times in the scriptures. When Jesus was preparing his disciples for the limited commission. In Matthew 10 and verse 16 it says, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves." He also reminds them in Romans 16 and verse 19, "For your obedience has come abroad unto all men. I am glad, therefore, on your behalf, but yet I would you have you wise unto that which is good, and simple concerning evil." And then we have it again in Philippians 2 and verse 15 we've already read. So to be harmless would mean the idea that we're free from any taint or any suspicion of evil. To never be suspected of duplicity, saying one thing and meaning another. To never be feared of potential harm or violence. Again, it means to be harmless as doves. Why is this important? Well, to be without fault is the idea that one, so that in Titus 2, verse 7 and 8, one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you. You know, I look around in our world today, and I see a lot of different movements that we have, political movements. How would this apply to the pro-life movement, who use at times intimidation, harassment, and sometimes even violence to further their cause? You know, every once in a while, you have people that will go out and kill these doctors that perform abortions. They are not helping God's cause. As much as they think they might be doing something good, that's not helping. Because all it does is it brings a spotlight on those people that stand up and say it is a wrong thing, it is murder to kill innocent children, innocent babies. And yet, the flip of that is, but it's okay to kill people who kill people, babies. It's not helpful at all. We have a thing called the Christian Coalition. Now, we're not a part of that. We understand the word Christian there is how the world defines what a Christian is. But they often advise the idea of digging up dirt on political opponents. The idea, we see the nastiness in politics. And sometimes we may laugh about it, sometimes we may say, wow, that was pretty good, but is that truly helping our cause? We're trying to pick and choose good people to run for office. Do not such efforts, though well-intentioned, often give others reasons to speak evil of those who call themselves Christians? And that's what in a lot of cases that happens. They speak evil of those who call themselves Christians. We should have the attitude of Paul. In 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 3 it says, we give no offense in anything, that our ministry may not be blamed. Paul reminds us we need to think first of God and his cause. Not become so wrapped up in the things of this world that we forget and maybe get blamed. In 2 Corinthians 8 and verse 21, it tells us to provide honorable things, not only in the sight of the Lord, but also in the sight of men. So the causes we may become involved in, we need to make sure that they're honorable. And we don't get behind movements that can bring reproach upon the Lord and call into question the name Christian. So the name often of God, the name of God will not be blasphemed by our conduct. And though written in reference to the idea of the Jews, we cannot allow Paul's rebuke to apply. We need to allow it to apply to those who resist evil in the wrong way. You know, I don't know how to fix abortion completely. I don't know how to fix unless we change the minds and hearts of the people of this world. And because of the decades that we have gone and decided that it is legal to murder innocent children, well, look at what we've got now going on in our world. It's brought a reference by my dad, the idea that we are now voting on whether or not we can allow a child to be born and then kill it. Whether a person reaches a certain age, and I think about this more now that I'm 55, I think about this more than I did when I was a teenager. But what's the cutoff when we decide that a person has reached an age where they're no longer a benefit to our society, and therefore they ought to die. And who's going to decide that? But you see, that's what our world has come to. But Jesus tells us to be harmless as doves, and Paul writes the very same thing. We are to react to evil the way Paul said we should react. Not with evil, but overcome evil with good. Change the hearts and minds of people. Not go out as militants, killing and destroying and maiming those who oppose us. We are to love our enemies the way Jesus taught us, the idea of active goodwill. And that is how we demonstrate ourselves to be truly the sons of God. Luke 6, verse 27 and following. But let's look specifically at Paul. How did Paul relate to civil government? If you would, turn to Acts chapter 22. We're going to do a little bit of reading here. Not a ton of it because we can't read the whole account. But I believe it's interesting to read some of the things that Paul wrote regarding his imprisonment, as well as the things that he went through. Chapter 22. And then we're going to look at verse 25. Now remember, Paul has been brought in. The Jews have brought charges against him. He's been brought in and arrested. They put him in jail, prison. And by that, some things have been done to him. Verse 25 says, as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion which stood by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned? See, Paul is about to remind them that he is wise as serpent, but harmless as a dove. You don't see Paul retaliating in the sense of getting in a fight. He's not fighting these men. He's not doing anything against them other than reminding them that he's about to use civil law, a law that has been given to him because he's a natural-born Roman. But see, it was against the law. In fact, it was a punishment by death. That if you were to go after someone who was a Roman citizen and you beat on them or anything like that, well, then your life was in jeopardy. Now Paul reminds them, is it right for you to go about beating me? Me, a Roman citizen? And I find it kind of interesting that they took him to the chief captain. Chief captain came and said, tell me, are you a Roman? He said, yea. Chief captain said, well, with a great sum I obtained of this freedom. And Paul said, but I was freeborn. You know, not to put anybody down, it's just kind of funny. Where do all the Texas jokes come from? People say that, you know, I wasn't born here, but I got here as fast as I could. It's the idea. Paul says, well, it's all well and good, you're a Roman citizen, but I came by mine honestly. I was born a Roman citizen. Well, they take him before the Sanhedrin. He goes through and he gives an account of how he was, all these things happened, and now he's before Festus in chapter 25. In verse 10 it says, then Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. So now he's appealed to Caesar, using civil government, a law that's been afforded him because he's a Roman citizen, to go before Caesar. All things being equal, if you're in a foreign country, and that country is not a savage country, if you get caught up in the middle of something, what you have as a right as a United States citizen is to tell someone, I need to go to the consulate. And all things being equal, they're supposed to deliver you there. Because that's what the consulate is there for, to help citizens of that country, of the country that you're from. Well, that's what Paul's done. He's used the laws of the land to bring about the hopes of getting a fair trial. Because he knows if he stays there in Jerusalem among the Jews, he will not get a fair trial because they're ready to kill him now, whether he did anything wrong or not. Well, he appeals to Caesar, and off he goes. You know, Nero was the Caesar to whom Paul appealed. And he was unjustly accused by the Jews and falsely imprisoned. Then Paul was taken to Rome and kept under guard for 2 years, chapter 28 and verse 30, before Nero finally heard his case. The great apostle won his appeal because as we go on to read 1 Timothy, Titus, and 2 Timothy, later he was condemned by that same ruler, but he was given his freedom for a time. According to Eusebius, a historian, Nero beheaded Paul and had Peter crucified. But are Christians subject to Nero? When Paul wrote to the Christians in Rome, he admonished them, let every soul be in subjection to the higher powers, chapter 13 and verse 1. There is a principle here that Paul taught them even though he was involved in the process. You must submit to higher powers. Here I am in prison. And I'm writing people out here who are running around free, and I'm reminding them that you have to submit to higher powers. And he tells them why, because they are instruments of God to do good to those who do good, to protect the good. He points out that civil government, generally speaking, is for the ordering or protection of society. The laws that they have directed to that end ought to be obeyed and must be obeyed. Peter himself wrote this very idea in 1 Peter 2, verse 13 and 14. Be subject unto every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or unto governors as sent by him. These passages are indicators of the inspired nature of the New Testament. Men who were writing under ordinary human impulses would hardly have encouraged brethren to honor and obey such a vile man as Nero. I don't have time to go into his life, but I'm going to tell you something. If you want to read about a vicious dictator, read about Nero. There's a lot out there. And read what he did to Christians. And yet here are Paul and Peter writing to the brethren, reminding them they must submit to civil authority. Everyday man wouldn't do that. So, well, if that government's not going to treat me right, then I'm going to revolt. I'm going to take up arms. I'm going to go against it. I'm going to kill everybody that ever represents them. Well, what do we have in our society today against authority? People we have that very mindset today. But Paul reminds us we must submit to the authorities. Christians who were not loyal. A man named Tacitus wrote to Nero, said about Nero's persecution, how that he brought some Christians who in turn then began to testify against their own brethren, and great multitudes were convicted, and many of them were put to death. It is of some interest that there were those church members in Rome who were willing to surrender their own brethren to the authorities in order for them to escape persecution, but for their brethren to be persecuted. And this cannot but remind us of the situation that Paul himself encountered when he was in the city. Look at Philippians chapter 1. Paul addresses this very idea of how the brethren had treated him. Philippians chapter 1 began at verse 12. But I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all palaces. And this is the same idea of what Paul is bringing to my mind when I read this about Joseph. When his brothers said, we did this to cause you harm, and Joseph reminds them, you did it to cause me harm, but yet God did it for the good. Well, Paul now is relaying this same idea that, these brethren out here, they're doing these evil things, and they're turning in our brethren, and they're saying evil things against me that cause me to be put in prison. But look at all the good things that have come from it. I'm able to speak to people that I never would have been able to speak to if I weren't here in this cell. He says, and many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill. So see, some were using Paul as a good thing, some were using it as evil. He says, the one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds. So the actions of these who are doing things that are evil, what are they doing? They're causing hardness to happen to Paul. But Paul says, that's okay. That's okay. But the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. Paul reminds them, they raise up affliction for him in his bonds. And it is no doubt to imagine that some of those very ones who turned state's evidence on Nero's brutal assaults. As we think about this, Paul wrote it in another situation in 1 Corinthians 6, if you want to turn over there. Would it be consistent with the scriptures for him and others who had treated him summarily to file a lawsuit for redress for the losses that they had suffered, particularly since the defendants in the suit would be members of the church? And I want to kind of get into this a little bit, first of all, because it was reminded of me to kind of go over this, but it's a good thing for us to think about. We live in a very litigious world. People are ready to drop lawsuits every minute. They want money. That's what they're looking for. They look for the jackpot. Go down here and buy something from somebody and it doesn't act right. Well, I want my money back plus more. I want to put you out of business. You won't bake my cake because I'm gay, therefore I'm going to put you out of business. We have these kind of things that are going on in our world. Well, what is the reaction of the Christian? Well, 1 Corinthians, I started talking and didn't turn over there. 1 Corinthians 6 says, dare any of you having a matter against another go to law before the unjust and not before the saints? Now, a lot of people stop right there and say, see right there, Paul's saying it's a sin for a Christian to go to court. If you got a problem, you deal with it among the brethren and don't take it any further. Because you don't want to get it out there in the world for people to see. But is that what Paul's saying? Do you not know that the saints shall judge the world? And the world shall be judged and the world shall be judged by you. Are you unworthy to judge the smallest matters? It doesn't happen to me because everybody loves me so much, but it does happen among some of you. You get on somebody's nerves. They don't like the way you drive. They don't like the way you dress. They don't like the way you do this. They don't like the way you smile or that you don't smile. And so it causes them to kind of get a little snitty. They're just, they just don't like you anymore. And over time, they may want to kind of twist that a little bit, cause it to get even worse and worse and worse to the point where now they've said, you've done me wrong. I don't like the way you look at me. Therefore, I'm going to take you to court. Small matters, little things. Paul says you don't take those things before the courts. You try to deal with those things among the brethren. He goes on to say, know you not that we shall judge angels? How much more things to pertain to this life? If then you have judgments of things pertaining to this life, set them to judge who are least esteemed in the church. I speak to your shame. Is it so that there is not a wise man among you? No, not one that shall be able to judge between his brethren. But brother goeth to law against brother, and that before the unbelievers. Now we could go on reading more and more, but the idea is there is put in our mind. What was the number one concern that was addressed very early in the Corinthian letter that Paul dealt with? It was in verse 10, divisiveness. This brother followed this brother, this group followed this person, and this did this and all this, and he's saying that ought not to be so. You ought to be united. Same mind and same judgment. But you know, when it comes to judgment sometimes, my idea is just as good as yours. And some people really, really, really get offended when their idea isn't chosen. And so what they might do is decide, well, fine. I'm going to be heard. You won't listen to me. Then I'm going to take you to court. Paul says those kind of things ought to be dealt with within the Lord's church. But you know, divisiveness, division, caused by certain carnal brethren, carnal meaning worldly, the idea that persons, their mind, their focus and all is based upon the things of this world. And they vent their differences in civil courts, thus dragging the church's troubles before an unbelieving community and bringing the Lord's people into disrepute. Paul therefore urges these brethren to settle their feuds among themselves, rather than parading them before the world. The apostle suggests it is better to suffer loss than to cause the church's influence to be damaged. Now, if we stop right there, many will say, well, then right there we can't take brethren to court. But is that what Paul was addressing here? Do Christians have no defense against lawbreakers? And lawbreakers in particular that may be brethren. How much loss is one required to suffer? You know, about 3 or 4 months ago, I hadn't talked about this because really it's just the way the world is. But my identity got stolen. And somebody opened up an account with Sprint and ran up almost $6,000 in phone equipment. Now, my first question to the Sprint people was, doesn't it kind of bring an alarm to your mind when somebody's trying to order something online and they're ordering multiple things and it's over $6,000? Doesn't that raise a red flag? Obviously not, because they let them buy it. And it was bought in Dallas or somewhere. It wasn't anywhere around here. Anyway, time went on. This was done last year. We just got the final bill telling us they're fixing to take us to court. That's the only thing we got in the mail. And they gave you a phone number, and I called them. Got into it with them. Well, I have to call the police. They have to come out and write a report. And I'm giving you this because this is true. This is real. This is something you need to think about. Pay attention to your bills. And as things start getting run up on there, you need to report it to the police. Because you got to fill out all this stuff. Police officer, very nice, all that stuff. Anyway, all things being equal, it never went on my credit. It got dissolved, expunged, whatever you want to call it, because they finally figured it out. But one of the questions the detective asked me when he came out there was, if these people are caught, and I'm thinking, yeah, right, okay. But if they're caught, do you want to press charges? And I looked at him and I said, yes. Because every time people do this, my taxes go up. The cost of goods goes up. Because they're stealing. Now, I use that as a for instance to put in your mind. Let's say a brother or a sister in the church did that to you. Now, I don't advocate going over there and beating them up. That's not what I'm talking about here. But you knew somebody well enough that maybe they got a hold of your Social Security number or enough facts that they could get together and get a credit card sent to them and get an account open in your name. I don't know about you, but I don't have $5,000 laying around. I couldn't pay that. Would it be a sin to take that brother or sister and give them over to the police and ultimately go to court, and maybe they even have to do some time? Do people read this to say right here, Paul says I can't do that? No, that's not what Paul's talking about here. What if I sold my house to a brother or sister in Christ, and he decided he's not going to make any more payments? Can I go legally and repossess that property? What if a brother steals my car? Can I report that to the police? Or must I have let him just keep the vehicle and say, well, we got to keep this, we can't talk about this, and I'm going to let you keep the vehicle, or I'm going to let you keep the house, because it's wrong to take a brother or sister to court? The admonition of 1 Corinthians 6 were not designed as a shield for outlaws. There were several matters that must be taken into account. And because we are running out of time, I'm going to have to go with this very quickly. I'm not going to be able to touch all of this. But what I think it comes down to is just simply this. I think it comes down to 3 points. I found these, and I thought they were very good. It says, what do I need to do? Well, first of all, I need to look at all the facts involved and ask myself, is the wrong that I have suffered, is it a petty thing? In other words, did somebody just say something they shouldn't have? Have they gossiped against me? That kind of thing. Is it petty, or is it significant? Is it disruptive to my life? Is it damaging to my family or to my name? Secondly, is there any way to settle the matter without displaying the discord between Christians before the unbelieving world? You know, somebody steals a car from you, you may not even know who did it. You just report it to the police. And now you got a brother or a sister in Christ you found out took the car. What are you going to do? Tell the police, no, let's just drop charges. I don't worry about it. I can't do that. And thirdly, is the controversy a matter of mere personal loss? Or does it involve law breaking that would injure others indefinitely and permit a continued abuse at the hands of unspiritual people? I guess it would be safe to say this. If there is a doubt in any person's life, in a person's mind, if his conscience is not at all ease in taking the matter to court, then suffer the loss and leave the execution of justice to God. If it's a matter of conscience, then don't do it. Leave it alone. But it wouldn't take but 1 or 2 stolen cars from me, and then I would say that's enough.